So this is this is following on somewhat from my first video, which was about internet censorship and the current purge, particularly in regard to bloggers. Naturally, that was the first subject I went to because, well, again, my website just got unceremoniously shut down by WordPress a few weeks ago. While bloggers and, shall we say, independent journalists are in some cases being shut down or censored online, one could argue that there's still hope in the form of, say, old school kind of journalism, right? That is to say, journalism in newspapers and news sites, for example. One could try to make that argument. But, well, is there really? The kind of content or research that you might find on independent blogs or channels, can you find any of that in the mainstream media? I mean, generally no, right? I mean, let's just use one example as a test subject. Let's use the example of the 7/7 London terrorist attacks, as this is a subject that I covered quite extensively on my site. Did any mainstream newspaper or website ever tackle or report on any of the obvious flaws or cover-ups in the official story of that event? No. Even the questions were never raised. Even though the questions were so obvious, and even though the holes in that official narrative were so numerous and so obvious, the questions were never asked, and zero critical thinking was employed. So it fell obviously to independent researchers and to bloggers and to, I guess, citizen journalists, if you like, to do that job, because the mainstream journalism just wasn't doing it, was staying away from it. And in a way, that's fine, because what it did for several years was to establish a new paradigm whereby you had the mainstream media on the one hand doing its thing and functioning by its rules and its standards and paradigms, and then on the other hand you had the alternative media and independent writers or researchers doing their thing and functioning by slightly different standards and paradigms, and it was up to you which one you preferred or which one you trusted more. But the point is that there were almost two parallel worlds of journalism or commentary, um, and you could choose between the two, or you could mix and match, whatever. And so what we're seeing now is one of those worlds, the alternative realm, being clamped down on and censored, so that I guess in the long term the paradigm can be restored to what it was in the old days, I guess, in the pre-internet days, or something like that. And as I said in the first video, I'm convinced the main thing that got my blog, The Burning Blogger of Bedlam, shut down was its archive of content on false flag operations. Um, and you'll see that almost anyone who talks about false flags now, including on YouTube, is being deleted, or censored. Um, and I mean, I'm starting to wonder if someday it could even be illegal to talk about false flags. Um, but if we don't talk about stuff like that, if once free and independent bloggers are no longer able to cover that territory, then who is going to do that work? Who is going to ask those questions? Which brings me back to the question about mainstream journalism and media. I mean, when was the last time that you read a really genuine piece of investigative journalism regarding something important? And that's a serious question, and that's the central question of this video, is when was the last time you read a really genuine piece of investigative journalism in the mainstream media or in a mainstream publication? Now, I'm admittedly mostly focusing on the UK here for obvious reasons. Um, and I can't 100% say that I can speak for the situation in the United States or in other European countries. Although I do read a lot of American and European media as well. I can't say that I read every single article in every single newspaper every day, but that's why I'm posing it here as a question rather than as a statement. So, when was the last time you read a seriously significant piece of investigative journalism in mainstream newspapers or mainstream news sites? Does such journalism, real, honest, investigative journalism, inconvenient journalism, uncovering inconvenient truths or exposing cover-ups, does that still exist? I mean, I assume it probably does, and that you could find a few pieces here and there by certain writers and or commentators, but I can't remember the last time I saw anything like that. And again, while I don't read absolutely everything, I am quite attentive to the newspapers. I mean, I have to be because, I do a lot of research for my own articles and my own content, and, most of that, or a lot of that, comes from keeping track of various newspapers and news sites from different countries. So I do read a lot and I do see a lot. And one of the principal and most obvious problems is that we have a system of news media in Western countries that are hugely politicized. Um, that is to say that, so, any given newspaper or news organization will kind of slant one way or the other in terms of politics or in terms of ideology. So you'll get left-leaning papers, or you'll get right-leaning conservative media, or you'll get very liberal media, or you'll get very unliberal media. But what that means is that you don't get objective, unbiased publications for the most part. So if you don't have objective, unbiased publications, how can you have objective and unbiased uh, journalism and content? I mean, that's just a basic problem that's always been there, I guess. And that, I mean, that's not even the main problem. That's not the point of this video. I mean, that's just me getting sidetracked and going off on a bit of a tangent. But also, I'm talking here about real investigative journalism, not opinion pieces by high-profile commentators. There's a huge difference between real journalism and just opinion pieces. Opinion pieces are plentiful, in fact. There's no shortage of them, with high-profile figures being paid very high sums of money to simply have an opinion on the news every week or every day. Investigative journalism, on the other hand, involves uncovering crucial information and facts, or doing substantial research in order to piece together a picture. Whereas opinion pieces are just, well, exactly that: people's opinions being passed off as journalism, but often or usually lacking in actual corroborating evidence or unbiased fact-finding. For the most part, and again, there are probably exceptions to this, but most mainstream journalism has become increasingly uniform, especially when it comes to big international events or agendas. And a really good example is the coverage of Syria, where it would be no exaggeration to say that almost 100% of all mainstream newspaper coverage of the conflict in Syria was singing from the same hymn sheet. Um, you know, Basically acting as a foreign policy mouthpiece for the governments. And to get alternative or more nuanced kind of coverage, you had to go to independent websites or journalists, or to bloggers. And a good example in regard to Syria being Vanessa Beeley, who was the primary independent researcher slash journalist who exposed the dubious nature of the White Helmets organization in Syria. And I spoke to Vanessa a bunch of times in the past because she would comment sometimes on the Burning Blogger of Bedlam and on my articles. Um, and she republished some of my articles on her site. And I would quote or reference some of her meticulous work quite often too. Um, and it's interesting because no one in the newspapers or news media was ever going to do that anymore. Like the stuff that she was doing was never going to be done by mainstream journalists. Um, but instead of addressing or instead of addressing her research or maybe interviewing her about it, what actually happened was that the mainstream journalists began to write hit pieces against her. They began attacking her. And why? Because she was providing a counter narrative, or because she wasn't part of the inner circle of vetted and paid for mainstream journalists, and she was countering the prevailing narrative. The point is that you would never have found any of that research that she did in any mainstream newspaper, um, because no journalist would have been willing to do it or to even look for it. Uh, and maybe that's a careerism, a career thing. I mean, if you're an up and coming journalist working for one of the major papers or news outlets, then you don't want to rock the boat, obviously. You want to keep your job, and you probably even want to rise in the organization or in the business in general. So you think about your career, obviously, and so you toe the line. I get that. I'm not really criticizing that. Um, but whereas if you're a blogger or an independent uh, researcher, then and you're generally working entirely without profit or any kind of money making or career motivation, then you can't be made to toe the line really, because you're coming from a completely different place and you're playing by completely different rules. Which is not to say that there aren't bloggers or independent journalists involved in I guess fake news or false information, um, because there are. I know that. But for the most part, it seems to me that independent writers or sites or bloggers have, for the last several years, been picking up the slack and handling or putting out the perspectives or doing the research that mainstream journalists and news sources stopped engaging in a long time ago. So it's no wonder then that certain bloggers and or sites are now being censored or shut down. Mainstream journalism seems to be pretty much under control now. Um, and you could argue that maybe it always was, but I think it's much worse now than it was, 20, 30 years ago. Um, and a really good way to illustrate that is to track the story and the career of someone like Seymour Hersh, a really celebrated and high-profile journalist, investigative journalist who was once almost universally praised and courted after by newspapers and publications, and who now basically can't get published in mainstream publications in the United States, for example, and has to rely on being published in other countries just to get his work out. And actually, I'm going to do a whole piece separately on Seymour Hersh, because it really illustrates this point really well. But again, mainstream journalism seems to be under control, um, whereas the Wild West of the internet has kind of been another matter. And you can't have these pesky, meddling writers or bloggers in their own little spaces, providing counter narratives or doing annoying research and dot connecting, to show a different picture of events to what the mainstream corporate-owned media is presenting. So of course, it's especially a problem when some of those writers or bloggers begin to really hit their stride and attract a good-sized audience or readership. It's also worth recognizing that large, substantial parts of the so-called alternative media are also under control. That is to say that large parts of the so-called alternative media have been co-opted or hijacked for some time, and are now simply servicing a prefabricated kind of propaganda role, um, essentially providing the other side of the manipulation equation to what the mainstream media is providing. And it's what I talked about in the first video, where they're creating a kind of binary system with the corporate-run media on the one side and the bulk of the co-opted kind of alternative media on the other side. And in terms of large parts of the alternative media being under control, um, that's something I've talked about in a number of articles on my site, and I've done a lot of kind of research into that. And when when the new website is set up, I'll re-establish that content. Um, but in terms of the mainstream journalists and media being, as I said, under control, let me back that up. Let me back that claim up a little more here. Um, I asked at the start, when was the last time that you read real investigative journalism from anyone in the mainstream media? And well, let's add another filter to that question, because I'm going to discount anything that came via, say, WikiLeaks, because WikiLeaks does not count as mainstream media engaging in or encouraging investigative or honest journalism. If newspapers like, for example, The Guardian, were running stories on anything that originated with WikiLeaks, then those newspapers and journalists cannot claim credit for that. They can't claim that as somehow giving them cred, as investigative journalists or truth seekers. The credit for that belongs to WikiLeaks. Um, and WikiLeaks is not a newspaper or a media organization, strictly speaking. And I say that here because one of the obvious things that you might cite as a modern example of investigative journalism uncovering and reporting on, inconvenient truths would be something like the Panama Papers. But that came from WikiLeaks, not from any of the newspapers or news organizations. Um, and while we're on that subject, the recent spectacle of Julian Assange being dragged out of the Ecuadorian embassy in London pretty much acts as a perfect image to symbolize the point about not just the lack of real journalism, but even the criminalization of it. The criminalization of journalism, essentially. So, all right, having established, the lack or the scarcity of real investigative journalists or journalism, let's just see how much worse it could get and how much worse it probably is going to get. So let's look at this. 2 years ago, not long after the Snoopers Charter was passed into law in the UK, the British government was also preparing draconian operations against journalists and whistleblowers. The legislation aimed, among other things, to raise the jail terms for leakers and whistleblowers from what was originally 2 years, now all the way up to 14 years. 14 years. And the plan seemed, blatantly designed to cripple journalists and to intimidate whistleblowers and to prevent any exposure of bad behavior, corruption, or activities that are contrary to the public interest, or any activities whose exposure is in the public interests. In short, the plans sought to arguably criminalize real journalism. Now, we could argue back and forth about whether Julian Assange qualifies as a journalist or not, but, journalist or whistleblower, leaker, etc., they all seem to be increasingly treated as one and the same. The language has shifted and has changed. The result, arguably, is that the media is no longer able to challenge the conduct of powerful people and financial elites. In this new state of affairs, things like the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers would never have been allowed to come to the attention of the general public at all in the first place. So essentially, any journalists or whistleblowers involved in these disclosures would be classed as foreign spies and locked up for up to 14 years. 14 years. In other words, it's not just leakers or whistleblowers at the source who are regarded as the criminals, but also any journalists who publish or use any of the information provided by those leakers or whistleblowers. And just to put that into some more kind of context, there was a 2017 article in The Verge which pointed out that under those laws, The Guardian's former editor could have faced criminal charges for his newspaper's part in publishing the Snowden leaks in 2013. You know, the leaks that revealed the existence of the secretive and illegal surveillance apparatus in the UK and the United States. Um, he could have faced jail time, the Guardian's editor, for publishing those. And that's kind of where we're at now, and that's where this is all heading. So what's happening now would seem to be a final assault on real journalism, um, to try to bring even those last vestiges of genuine, honest journalists into line. And that is in part what these what these whistleblower laws are about. Um, Whereas something like the Snoopers Charter or the NSA is aimed more at policing the public, this is aimed more squarely at the sources of information for the public, so specifically journalists and whistleblowers. So, if there's already a major lack of journalists in the mainstream publications willing to go against the tide when concerted propaganda operations are in swing, and, take Syria as a good example, then this is going to be even more the case in the future, when journalistic conformity is not just simply a case of peer pressure or careerism, but the actual fear of penalisation or even jail time. So, with all of this being taken into account, you then have to ask yourself the question of whether true or real journalism is dead, basically. Um, and if it isn't dead yet, then surely it will be very soon. If so, then we would argue that what's needed is independent journalists, researchers or writers outside of the corporate influenced or corporate controlled media structure. And they would have their own platforms, um, their own independent platforms, or they would rely on platforms like like WordPress or YouTube. Um, and well, yes, that has been the case for the last several years, but now those realms are also being brought under control too. So, you see these mass takedowns and censorship actions being taken on YouTube, for example, some of them justified, most of them not justified, and of course on blogging platforms like WordPress, which I covered in the previous video, and which included my website, The Burning Blogger of Bedlam, which was also taken down a month ago. So information control seems to be in full swing now, right across the board, both in the mainstream media and in the previously ungoverned wild space of the internet, which leaves you with the question of, if there are essentially no investigative journalists really in the mainstream media anymore, um, and you're also seeing a crackdown against independent journalists and bloggers and the like, then where are you going to get your perspective or your information from, or where is the balance going to be? And I don't have an answer to that. Um, it's a question. It's a question. It's just a question to think about, but it's an important question.